I never thought I'd live to see the day, but Konami actually did something with Metal Gear Solid. Coincidentally, I just played every single Kojima game, and now I'm going to tell you how good or bad they were. With all those Metal Gear Solid remake rumors floating around for so long, I decided to dive back into Kojima's works and find out how they all stacked up against each other. Now, just to be clear, the games we're talking about today are specifically games directed by Kojima. Not produced by Kojima, not co-directed, just Kojima-directed games, as far as I know. With that said, let's dive in. At number 11, we have Metal Gear. Metal Gear released in 1987 on the MSX2, known for such games as Metal Gear and Metal Gear 2. You know, when you're putting together a ranking for a video game series, you might start by saying, while this game may be at the bottom, all the games in this series are enjoyable to play, but something had to be at the bottom. This is not one of those times. I can see what Metal Gear was going for, and indeed a lot of the ideas in Kojima's directorial debut were sort of recycled and reused in the sequel and the eventual Metal Gear Solid, and I could see how perhaps in 1987 this could be a very cool, very fun, very interesting game to play. But I'm not creating this list in 1987. This list is based on how a game feels to play and experience right meow in 2023 and or the near future. And right now, the original Metal Gear is tedious. And not to get too far ahead of myself, but the word tedious came to mind a lot when playing Kojima's pre-Metal Gear Solid games. Metal Gear has a lot of standing around and waiting, an unforgiving checkpoint system, tons of backtracking, and it just requires a lot of imagination to immerse yourself in the world of this game. Again, I understand the graphical limitations of a game made in 1987, but I mean, look at this. Then you've got things like juggling several keycards with no indication for what door requires which card, random pits opening up in the ground and having to bomb walls out of nowhere with no indication other than making a weird sound when you punch them. The bosses aren't particularly interesting either. Even the Metal Gear you fight at the end is stationary and just requires you to place bombs on the legs in an overly specific sequence. Therefore, Metal Gear is squarely at the bottom of the list. At number 10, we have Snatcher. Among other platforms, Snatcher eventually got an English localization on the Sega CD, which is how I played it. Snatcher is quite different from the Metal Gear games, being a graphic adventure game that is basically Blade Runner / Terminator and a few other filmic inspirations. Kojima is 70% movies after all. The gameplay here seems promising at first, giving you various investigative options from dialogue to room inspection and database searching, but it quickly becomes tedious, as the game pretty much requires you to exhaust all options beyond belief in every scenario until things finally decide to move forward. And I often found it really confusing trying to figure out how to get the characters to just do things. They'd say something like, this stain on the desk looks suspicious, and then you're given no option to do anything other than look at it some more. Meanwhile, I'm screaming at my computer for them to look up like any normal human would do.
Just do it!
There are occasionally interesting questions or puzzles to solve, but a lot of it's pretty cut and dry. The story's not much to write home about either. If you've played Kojima games before, you pretty much know what you're in for. Conspiracies, silly robot buddies, super insular character groups that keep circling back on themselves, twists that aren't all that surprising, way too much world-building information, all of which is required reading here, and monologues. The end of this game has a wicked monologue that I frankly had trouble paying attention to. It's also incredibly self-referential. The secondary character is literally called Metal Gear Mark II. This game has its interesting moments, but it's just a real pain to get through the gameplay, and the plot is mostly standard fare. At number 9, we have Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake. I feel like Metal Gear 2 is about when Kojima started getting his proverbial groove. It's honestly kind of what I thought the first game would be like. You can really see Metal Gear Solid DNA in this game. The visuals are more well realized, the characters feel slightly more like characters, there's some really nice music, and a lot of Kojima's isms, for better or worse, are much more prevalent in this game. Bosses monologuing as they die, weird mechanics like using an owl to trick someone into thinking it's nighttime, crawling into vents, extended codec conversations. It just feels more like a Metal Gear Kojima game. It does still have pitfalls and exploding walls, plus people are always telling you their codec frequencies in really esoteric ways, which got pretty annoying. The last stretch of the game also got pretty tough and required a few restarts for me. And there are one or two areas which are an incredible drag to get through, like this swamp with invisible paths you have to brute force your way through until you finally make your way to the other side. The plot was definitely more interesting to follow than the first, but if you've played the Metal Gear Solid games, there won't be anything too unfamiliar for you. It's definitely better than the first Metal Gear, but I don't think I'll ever be coming back to this one. At number 8, we have Police Knots. Much like Metal Gear 2, Police Knots is basically Snatcher 2.0. The biggest difference between the two is that Police Knots never got an official English translation. Suffice it to say, this game was the most difficult one to set up. But putting that aside, this game was a definite improvement over Snatcher. A majority of the game is more straightforward and less exhaustive than Snatcher was. I didn't find myself having to click on absolutely everything as often as with that game, which is good because they changed the format in Police Knots from a menu with limited options to a cursor that can click anywhere. They also ditched the confusing look investigate combo and generally made the conversation mechanics smoother and easier to understand. The introduction and the last couple hours do veer back into Snatcher territory with tedious puzzles, lots of required conversation about science jargon and world building, and semi-frustrating gunplay sections. The story is definitely more interesting to follow than Snatcher's. There are even a couple moments that are sort of touching. This is definitely helped by an improved art style and some sick music. Now, it's still a Kojima joint, so you can expect all of his isms. I mean, the two main characters are just Riggs and Murtaugh from Lethal Weapon, and his horniness is on full display in this game. Ugh, come on, man. It's kinda hard to recommend this one because of how difficult it is to actually play, but this one was actually kind of enjoyable. You may be wondering if you accidentally skipped ahead. You did not. When Metal Gear Solid 4 first came out, it was hailed as a masterpiece and got its fair share of 10 out of 10s from reviewers. This game was the reason I bought a PS3 back in 2009. I was very much drinking the Kool-Aid back then. I'm no longer drinking the Kool-Aid. So one of the stronger aspects of this game is its graphics. In terms of the fidelity of character models and environments Kojima Productions managed to squeeze out of a 7th gen console, it's pretty damn impressive. However, the art direction really sours this in my opinion. Hey, how about we desaturate everything and crank the darks and brights to 11?
Oh yeah, it's all coming together.
Koji Pro also upgraded their controls to something more modern and intuitive. The game feels pretty good to play, and they introduced some cool new stuff like the Octo Camo, and there are plenty of interesting little mechanics to dig into if you look for them. But you don't get to play the game that much. It's like they misunderstood the assignment. I mean, the first 2 chapters are okay, but chapter 3 is an absolute travesty. And I hate to sound so hyperbolic, but it just has awful gameplay and somehow even worse plot delivery. The game has a general issue of making you sit and listen to 2 people talking about the most inane, esoteric crap, and after a while it gets really hard to pay attention. It commits the crime of being simultaneously dumb and boring. There is a metric ton of bad dialogue in this game, and hardly any charisma to distract you from it. Liquid Ocelot is the exception though. He's the Palpatine of this game. Whenever Liquid showed up, I breathed a sigh of relief. The music from Harry Gregson Williams is still very strong and one of the few unquestionably good things about the game, in my opinion. The highs in this game are really high. The fight between Snake and Liquid is untouchable, and there are a few other moments that are fantastic as well. But a lot of this game, and I mean a lot, was just not fun to get through. In summary, too much video, not enough game. At number 6, we have Peace Walker. Until now, I had only played this game once, many years ago, and I was thinking it would be pretty low on the list. And while it is still sort of low, I found myself enjoying this one a lot more than I thought I would. Peace Walker in some ways feels like quintessential Metal Gear Solid turned up to 11. From the gameplay and level design to the boss encounters, character interactions, the music, the crazy gadgets you can get. For my money, it doesn't get much more Metal Gear than Peace Walker, and that brings plenty of benefits as well as detriments. Let me first say that the plot and characters of this game are just bonkers. There were plenty of moments that had me questioning why a character did something, or why Kojima is so horny, or how one man could escape captivity so many times, or how this guy was allowed to hit this button.
What's that noise?
There's plenty of other stuff like the name Hot Coldman, or Kojima's weird Spanglish integration, or Pacifica Ocean, but there's just not enough time to dive into all of that. Suffice it to say, this game has some crazy shit going on. But, for the most part, it's at least entertaining, so it gets a couple points there. This game was originally on the PlayStation Portable, which brought along its own limitations. The graphical fidelity and the controls are the most prominent examples. The controls feel pretty good in the PS3 port, but there are still some movement limitations. The sneaking sections are kind of a cakewalk since they designed the game around the PSP's limitations, but they're still pretty fun. One positive that came from being on the PSP is the game's structure. Much like the more popular MGS5, this game is split up into bespoke missions. On top of this, Peace Walker introduced the mother base concept along with developing various weapons and items. Peace Walker is legit addicting to play. I found myself playing long after I had reached the ending just to develop more materials and experience more of the side quests. Say what you will about the Phantom Pain, but Peace Walker has it beat for interesting side missions and gear for you to use. I mean, you can fight dinosaurs in this game for Christ's sake. At number 5, we have Metal Gear Solid. For a lot of people, this is where it all began. And while this isn't actually the first Metal Gear, it was a real watershed moment for the series in terms of technical achievement and popularity. And it's a clear refinement of what had come before with Metal Gear 2. There are even elements from that game that are basically reused here. You could kind of argue that Kojima remade the same game like 4 times, including MGS2. But that's beside the point. Metal Gear Solid made such a big impression for a reason. The story elements, while not amazing, are very good for the medium at the time. The cast turned in great performances and the story mostly made sense. It's still kinda crazy, what with the cyborg ninja and the clone armies and whatnot, but this is not Kojima at his worst. The graphics definitely show their age, but it's not too hard to look past them. The rigidness of the gameplay is a little harder to overlook. Things like only being able to move in 8 directions or not being able to walk slowly do occasionally detract from the experience. This game does, however, have plenty of primo boss fights and a boatload of memorable moments and encounters. It was a bit of a tight race between this and Peace Walker, but the thing that put Metal Gear Solid ahead is its general feel, its vibe. Metal Gear Solid has a strong sense of atmosphere that permeates throughout its level design, music, and dialogue. And not for nothing, this game has what I would argue is the best ending of the series. So if you exclude pre-MGS stuff, Death Stranding falls squarely in the middle of the list. And that feels pretty appropriate. Death Stranding is Kojima dressed in his Sunday best farting on stage for 20 hours. I don't know if that metaphor makes sense either, but I'll just go ahead and elaborate. Death Stranding is a game that I play regularly, like once a month since release at least, usually more. I love the gameplay of Death Stranding. I love the progression of equipment you unlock. I love perfectly organizing my cargo. I love the act of walking in this game. If I ever need to just decompress and play something that puts me at ease, this is my go-to. But I absolutely cannot stand the plot and characters of this game. It feels like a majority of the narrative is characters flatly explaining the mechanics and workings of the world and the effects of the Death Stranding, half of which barely makes sense. And the rest is Kojima just not understanding how humans interact or generally behave. If I were to make a list of what game would be best to watch as a cutscene compilation, Death Stranding would be in the pits of Tartarus. But again, I love everything else about it. The game isn't for everyone, but for what it is, it's incredibly polished, from its gameplay to its graphics and animations. All this is to say, I hate Death Stranding, but I also love it. So number 4 feels like a good spot. Metal Gear Solid 5 is definitely the black sheep of the Metal Gear series. Its tone is distinctly different from all the prior entries, and it really feels like Kojima was ready to move on from the series and do something different. And aside from that, it's an incomplete game. There are some people who would argue it's intentionally unfinished and that Kojima is a genius playing 4D chess and that the title Phantom Pain can wave away any criticisms you might level at the game. But all that hardly matters because the game is still extremely satisfying and addicting to play. Most of what I said about Peace Walker's gameplay loop can be applied to this game as well, but the graphics are much prettier and the controls are way tighter. As I mentioned before, Peace Walker does have this one beat for wacky weapons and interesting side ops, and the environments here are a bit drab and empty, but there are just so many interesting emergent scenarios you can create with all the tools that the Phantom Pain gives you. The AI is more responsive and fun to mess with, and the systems that this game implements are still above and beyond what many open world games are doing today. As for the plot, it's fine. Very different, kind of drab, overly serious and simultaneously nonsensical, but it's inoffensive. I will touch on Ground Zeroes briefly to mention the level of quality and polish that seems lacking in the Phantom Pain. Like Peace Walker, Ground Zeroes had more interesting and fleshed out side ops and interactions compared to the Phantom Pain, which is kind of a shame for the latter, but the gameplay is still excellent overall. Sons of Liberty was my first foray into Metal Gear Solid, and it was quite a ride. Obviously, for some longtime fans of the series, this game was a real bait and switch, so the reception of this game can be a bit polarizing. But for me, this game is one of the greats, though I will admit a lot of it is actually the narrative. The gameplay of Metal Gear Solid 2 is decent, but if that were the only thing for the game to hang its hat on, I don't know that I would have played it more than once or even continued to play the rest of the series. The gameplay just feels a little more restrictive than other Metal Gear Solid games. I don't feel encouraged to branch out and try things other than tranking or punching guys to knock them out. The game also has a pretty weak showing for bosses compared to the rest of the series. And there are a lot of segmented gameplay sequences. You've got the bomb detecting sequence, the sniping sequence, the don't get hit by the railgun sequence, vent missiles, swimming, shooting C4, the list goes on. Just a lot of bespoke sections where you need to do a specific thing with less room for experimentation. But the story is what really draws me into this game. All the crazy twists the conspiracy plots, the codec conversations with Raiden and Rose. This game is dripping with atmosphere, as the first game was. And a big part of that is the music, which is just phenomenal, and probably my favorite music in any Kojima game. The story does take a while to get going, and while there are entirely too many cutscenes and codec calls interrupting the gameplay, the stuff that is shown and talked about by and large is worth seeing. Even now, 20 plus years later, the sequence with the AI and Raiden is still prescient and kind of haunting. It's not all perfect, there is definitely some goofy stuff that takes you out of the moment, but they hit the mark more than they miss it in this game.
What a thrill, with darkness and silence through the night.
Is it a predictable choice? Perhaps. But Snake Eater's just the best one, okay? I can't disagree with science. Metal Gear Solid 3 takes a trip back in time, away from the dour techno horror of the 2000s, and takes on a whole new, goofier, more carefree tone. The opening cinematic spells it out pretty nicely. There are definitely some dramatic moments, which also work fantastically for the most part, but they're balanced very nicely with more lighthearted spy action fare. The game has the most illustrious and entertaining cast, from femme fatale Eva to sadistic, goofy Bond villain Volgin, and plenty more besides. The music is once again fantastic and fits the game beautifully, the cutscenes are more interesting to follow consistently throughout the game, and the story doesn't get in the way of the gameplay like it did with Sons of Liberty. There are plenty of lengthy sections of gameplay in which you can take multiple paths, use different tools and weapons, and generally experiment more than in other entries. This last point also applies to the bosses. Speaking of which, Snake Eater has the best boss roster in any Kojima game, hands down. Volgin, Ocelot, the boss, and the end? Possibly one of the best boss fights of all time. It's a great idea, fantastically executed. Snake Eater just gets it. It nails the gameplay, the tone, the characters, everything. It's just the best one. But hey, maybe if Kojima really steps up his writing game in Death Stranding 2, well, at least the gameplay will be good. Wowee, what a video. Listen, I got some stuff on Patreon that you're going to want to check out, like my extended thoughts on some of the games in this video. Also, share this with your friends if you liked it. It means a lot. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.